For 41 years I kept other people's books. Not the books you read for pleasure. The other kind. Ledgers. Columns of numbers and narrow rules, red ink for what went out, black for what came in, and a thin pencil line at the bottom of each page where the two were supposed to meet and never quite did. I worked for a hardware store on the edge of a small town you have never heard of, and before that I did the same work for a feed mill, and before that, when I was young enough to still believe numbers could not lie to you, I did the books for my own father's little shop, which failed anyway, numbers or no numbers. I tell you this not because bookkeeping is interesting. It is not. I tell you this because I learned something in those 41 years that I did not learn in church, though I have gone to church my whole life, and that I did not learn from any book on finance, though I have read a great many of those too, out of professional obligation more than hope. I learned it slowly, the way you learn the shape of a room you have lived in for decades, by bumping into the same corner of the same table so many times that one day you finally stop and ask why the table is there at all. Here is what I learned. There are two ledgers. There is the ledger you keep, and there is the ledger you live inside of without ever opening it yourself. And this morning, before we go any further, I want to ask you something, because it is the kind of question that deserves an answer, not just from me, but from you. Somewhere in the next few minutes, before this reflection is finished, I am going to ask you to write down, in the comments, the one need you are carrying into today. Not a want. A need. The rent. The medicine. The gap between what is owed and what is on hand. I am not asking you to explain it, or justify it, or perform your faith for strangers. I am asking because there is something that happens when a hidden number is spoken aloud, and I think you already know that, or you would not still be watching. And if this kind of morning company is useful to you, if a slow voice thinking through scripture and ledgers and the ache of not having enough is something you want more of, then subscribing costs you nothing and tells me you are out there. But that is a small thing. The question is the large thing. What do you need provided today? Hold that answer loosely in your mind while I tell you about the manna. Before I take you to the desert, I want to sit with the shame for a moment, because nobody talks about the shame, and I think the shame is doing more damage than the actual shortfall in most people's lives. I watched it for 41 years, sitting across from customers who had fallen behind on an account, and I want to describe what I saw, because I think you may recognize it in yourself even if you have never had a hardware store bill. There is a particular way a person's shoulders change when they come to admit they cannot pay. It is not the same posture as grief, and it is not the same as anger, though both of those show up too. It is smaller than either. It is the posture of someone bracing to be assessed, the way you brace before a doctor delivers a verdict you already suspect is bad. I used to think, when I was younger in the trade, that people were ashamed of the number. I do not think that anymore. I think they were ashamed of what the numbers seemed to say about them, which is a very different thing. A number is neutral. It does not have opinions. But we have decided, somewhere in the collective nervous system of this culture, that an unpaid bill is a verdict on your worth, your discipline, your competence as a grown adult, and so people walk into a conversation about $40 carrying the full weight of a referendum on their character. I do not think God reads ledgers that way, and I want to say this as plainly as I know how, because I think a great many sincere people pray about money while secretly believing that their need is itself a kind of failure they must apologize for before they are allowed to ask. The manna story does not support that belief. Nobody in that wilderness earned their hunger through moral failure. They were hungry because they were human, in a desert, 6 weeks removed from 400 years of slavery, and their hunger was simply a fact of their condition, not a verdict on their worth. God did not make them prove they deserve bread before He sent it. He did not audit their complaining before He answered it. I think if you are carrying shame about your own need this morning, on top of the need itself, You are carrying a weight the story never asked you to carry, and it might be worth setting that second weight down before we go any further, even if the first one, the actual bill, the actual gap, is still sitting there waiting to be dealt with. I did not come to the manna story quickly. For most of my life I filed it under children's stories, the kind illustrated with cheerful bread flakes falling like snow onto smiling desert families. A nice picture for a nursery wall, and nothing more for a grown man staring at an overdraft notice. It took an actual season of not having enough, in my own life, in my 50s, after the feed mill closed and before the hardware store hired me, for me to go back and read the 16th chapter of Exodus the way you read something written about you personally rather than about ancient strangers in a desert you will never see. Here is where they were. 6 weeks out from Egypt. The excitement of the crossing, the drowned horses, the singing on the far shore, all of that was already old news. What they were dealing with now was hunger, which does not care how good your testimony was 6 weeks ago. Hunger has a very short memory for other people's miracles. And so they did what hungry, frightened people do. They complained, bitterly, and they told Moses that slavery in Egypt at least had pots of meat in it, which is one of the more honest lines in all of Scripture, because it is exactly the kind of thing the mind says when it is afraid. The mind does not compare your present hunger to God's past faithfulness. It compares your present hunger to somebody else's remembered fullness, even if that fullness came at the price of your freedom. I want you to notice something before we go further, because I think it matters more than the miracle that is about to happen. God did not rebuke them for complaining. Read it again sometime, slowly, without the assumption that you already know what it says. There is no lightning bolt for grumbling. There is no lecture about gratitude. What there is, instead, is provision. Bread falls before the complaint is even fully answered. This is not how I would have written this story, if I am honest. I would have made faith the entrance fee for the miracle. God did not. The bread came with a rule attached, though, and the rule is the part one could not stop thinking about once I finally understood what it was asking. Gather only enough for today. Not enough for the week. Not enough to sell to the neighboring tribe for a profit. Not enough to finally feel secure. Enough for today, and no more, except on the day before the Sabbath, when they were told to gather double, because tomorrow was going to be a day of rest, and God, apparently, does not intend to make you choose between resting and eating. I should mention, because I skipped it the first time through and I do not want to give you a tidier story than the one actually written, that bread was not the only thing that fell that season. Quail came too, in the evenings, thick enough to cover the camp, arriving specifically in answer to the same round of complaining about the meat pots of Egypt I mentioned earlier. I find this detail almost embarrassing to read, in the best way, because it means God's response to their grumbling was not a lesson in austerity. He did not say, essentially, learn to be grateful for bread alone and stop asking for meat. He sent the meat too, that same evening, alongside the bread that would fall the next morning. I think this matters because it is tempting, especially for people trying to sound spiritual, to imagine that trusting God for provision means training yourself to want less, to be satisfied with the plainest possible answer to prayer, and to feel guilty for wanting anything beyond bare survival. The wilderness story does not support that either. The people complained about wanting meat, specific, savory, remembered comfort, not abstract survival, and God, apparently unbothered by the specificity of their appetite, sent quail thick enough to cover the ground. Bring him your actual appetite this morning, not merely your bare minimum survival number. He was not offended by the request for meat. He answered it the same week he answered the request for bread. Some of them could not do it. Verse 20 of that chapter says it plainly, that some of them left a portion of it until morning, out of what I can only describe as understandable, ordinary human fear, and it bred worms and stank. I have read that verse probably 200 times in my life, and it was not until I was 58 years old, sitting at my own kitchen table with a stack of bills I could not fully pay, that I understood what it was actually describing. It is not a story about bread going bad. It is a story about what fear does to provision when you try to hoard it past its appointed day. The bread was not designed to be stockpiled. It was designed to be trusted, one day at a time, and when people tried to convert trust into inventory, the inventory rotted in their hands. I built spreadsheets for a living. Do you understand how strange this is for a man like me to have to accept? My entire professional instinct is to project forward, to build reserves, to never, ever run a business on a day-to-day basis if you can help it, because day-to-day is how businesses die. And here is God, feeding an entire nation, on purpose, one day at a time, for 40 years, specifically preventing them from doing the one thing every financial advisor I have ever respected would tell you to do. He did not let them build a reserve. He let them build a relationship instead, one that had to be renewed every single sunrise whether they felt like it or not. I do not think that contradiction is an accident, and I do not think it is only about ancient bread. I think it is about you, this morning, however many thousands of years later, looking at whatever gap exists between what you have and what is owed. The instinct, when you are afraid about money, is almost always to try to solve tomorrow today, to lie awake doing the arithmetic of next month, and the month after, running scenarios, building a private spreadsheet of dread. And there is a kind of planning that is wise. I am not going to stand here and tell you budgets are faithless. I built budgets for 4 decades and I believe in them. But there is another kind of forward-looking that is not planning at all. It is hoarding fear the way those wandering families hoarded bread, trying to gather enough anxiety today to cover every day that might come, and it rots in your hands exactly the same way, because you were never built to carry tomorrow's weight with today's strength. There is something worth understanding about why the mind behaves this way at all, why a person lying awake over an unpaid bill cannot simply decide to stop, the way you might decide to stop humming a tune. I am not a physician and I do not want to overstate what I know, but I have read enough, and watched enough frightened customers across a counter, to say this much with confidence. A brain under financial threat does not experience the threat as an abstract, distant concern to be managed calmly during business hours. It experiences it the way an earlier version of a human being, standing on an open plain, would have experienced the sight of a predator in the grass. The body does not know the difference between a lion and a past due notice. It releases the same chemistry, tightens the same muscles, narrows the same attention, and keeps that narrowed attention running long after the actual danger has passed, because the ancient parts of us were built for threats that resolved quickly, one way or another, not for threats like a mortgage that can hang over a household for years. This is not a design flaw in you. It is simply what a nervous system built for lions is doing with a threat shaped like a spreadsheet. I say this because I think it matters, spiritually, to stop interpreting your own sleeplessness as evidence of weak faith. Lying awake at 3 in the morning running the numbers is not proof that you do not trust God enough. It is proof that you have a body, built the way all human bodies are built, doing exactly what bodies do when they perceive a threat to survival, which a mortgage payment genuinely is, in the ancient parts of the brain that do not read financial statements but do understand the word shelter. The wilderness generation's grumbling at Moses was not, I think, primarily a theological failure either. It was a room full of exhausted nervous systems, doing what nervous systems do, and God's answer was not a lecture about better brain chemistry. It was bread. There is an older story in the same book, further back, that makes this contrast almost impossible to miss once you notice it, and I confess it took me years of reading past it before I finally saw the two economies sitting side by side in the same set of scrolls. Generations earlier, A young man named Joseph, sold into Egypt by his own brothers, rose to become the administrator of the greatest storehouse economy the ancient world had ever seen. 7 years of surplus, gathered systematically, warehoused with tremendous foresight, so that when the 7 years of famine arrived, Egypt alone among the nations had bread and grain, and enough left over to sell to every starving neighbor who came asking, including, eventually, the very brothers who had sold him. It is a magnificent story of planning, and I do not think Scripture condemns it. Foresight is not sin. Joseph's storehouses saved an entire region, and I have spent too many years respecting good bookkeeping to pretend that stockpiling is inherently an act of unbelief. But notice what happens a few generations later, to Joseph's own descendants, wandering in the wilderness under a different economy entirely. They are the grandchildren, in a manner of speaking, of the very people who built and administered the greatest grain reserve in the ancient world, and God does not give them a storehouse. He gives them a morning. Every single day, for 40 years, the descendants of the master of Egyptian storehouses had to walk outside their tents with empty hands and no guaranteed inventory, trusting a supply chain that existed nowhere except in the character of God Himself. I do not think that is a contradiction in Scripture. I think it is a deliberate education. Joseph's generation needed to learn what wise planning could accomplish. Moses' generation needed to learn something planning cannot give you at all, which is the muscle of trusting a provider you cannot audit, a supply you cannot see stacked in a warehouse anywhere, only trusted, morning after morning, on the evidence of yesterday's provision and nothing more concrete than that. I think most of us live somewhere between those two stories, and I think most financial fear comes from trying to force one of those economies into a situation that actually calls for the other. Sometimes you are being asked to plan like Joseph, to gather wisely while the surplus is available, because a famine really is coming and foresight really will save lives. But sometimes, and I think this is the harder lesson for people like me who spent a career loving spreadsheets, you are being asked to live like the wilderness generation, without a storehouse, without an inventory, without any guarantee beyond the character of the one who fed you yesterday, because that is simply the season you are in. And no amount of anxious forward planning is going to conjure a warehouse where God has specifically chosen, for reasons of His own, to teach you the harder muscle instead. There is a phrase, much later, in a prayer that a Jewish rabbi taught his followers to pray, and it has been said so many times, in so many rooms, that it has almost gone invisible from overuse, the way a word repeated 50 times in a row starts to sound like nonsense. Give us this day our daily bread. I want you to hear it again as if for the first time, because I think it is the New Testament's quiet footnote to the manna story, written by someone who clearly knew his exodus. Not give us this month our monthly bread. Not give us this year our annual security. This day. Daily. The prayer does not ask for a warehouse. It asks for a morning's worth, trusting there will be another prayer tomorrow, and another morning to go with it. There is a detail in the wilderness account that sits just outside the manna story proper, though it belongs beside it, and I think it deserves a moment before we go further. The same chapters that describe daily bread also describe a pillar, cloud by day and fire by night, that went ahead of the people and told them when to move and when to stay still. I find it significant that provision and guidance traveled together in that desert, rather than provision arriving as a kind of blind mechanical drop with no relationship to direction. The bread told them they were fed. The pillar told them they were not lost. I think a great many of us, in a financial crisis, experience the fear of the shortfall and the fear of not knowing what to do next as two separate terrors, when in the wilderness they were addressed by the same faithfulness, the same presence, moving through both at once. If you find yourself this morning uncertain not only about the number but about the next decision entirely, whether to take the job, whether to sell the item, whether to ask the relative, I do not think that confusion is separate from the question of provision. I think it is worth asking, in the same breath as you ask for bread, for the pillar as well, for a sense of which direction today's steps should take, trusting that the God who fed a nation for 40 years did not consider guidance a separate department from provision. I want to say one more thing before Frank, about a single word in that later prayer, because I skipped past it too quickly a few minutes ago and it deserves to be noticed. The prayer does not say, "Give me this day my daily bread." It says, "Give us." I did not appreciate, for most of my life, how strange that plural is, sitting inside what feels like such an intensely personal request. But the wilderness was never fed household by household, each family gathering in isolated anxious silence behind its own tent flap. It was fed as a camp, a people, a community bound together by the same daily rhythm of walking out with empty hands. I think this is why Frank's mortgage ended up paid by neighbors he had lived beside for years without ever really needing them. A network of small requests and small offers that none of them could have predicted in advance. The porch that needed fixing belonged to someone who knew someone who told two others. Provision, in Scripture, is very rarely a solitary transaction between one person and a silent sky. It moves through hands, through neighbors, through a community that is being fed the same bread at the same time, which means that part of receiving your own daily bread honestly might include noticing whose hands it is likely to travel through, and whether you have let anyone close enough to be one of those hands. I want to tell you about a man I will call Frank, though that was not his name, because I sat across a folding table from him more times than I can count during the last years I worked at the hardware store, helping him sort out an account that kept sliding further behind. Frank was 54, a construction foreman in a town in Ohio where the work had gotten thin, and then thinner, until the framing crew he ran was let go 2 weeks before Christmas, not because anyone did anything wrong, but because the developer who had been financing 3 subdivisions ran out of financing. Frank had built houses for 29 years. He had never once, in his own words, been the guy who needed help. He came into the store that January looking for a part he could not afford, and instead of buying it he stood at the counter and, in the flattest voice I have ever heard a grown man use, told me he did not know how he was going to make the mortgage payment due in 9 days. I did not have a miracle for Frank. I want to be honest about that, because too many of these stories end with a check arriving in the mail from a stranger, and I am sure that happens sometimes. But it did not happen to Frank, and I think God is more interested in your character than in your theater, so I am not going to lie to you about how it went. What happened to Frank was slower, and I think, in its own way, stranger. He came back to the store 2 days later and asked if we needed part-time help behind the counter, 20 hours a week, at a wage that was almost embarrassing for a man who used to run a crew of 11. He took it. Then a neighbor, hearing he had time on his hands in the mornings, asked him to look at a sagging porch, paid him in cash, and told 2 other neighbors. By March, Frank had pieced together something that was not what he used to have, and was not enough, by any spreadsheet's definition of enough, and yet the mortgage got paid every single month, sometimes with $4 left over, sometimes with 40, never with 4,000. Frank told me once, leaning on that same counter, that it was the closest he had ever come to understanding what daily bread might actually mean for a grown man with a mortgage and a wife and no savings left. Not a windfall. A sequence of just enoughs, arriving one at a time, each one requiring him to trust the next morning before he had any proof it was coming. I have thought a great deal, since Frank, about why that season nearly broke him in a way that the actual math did not fully explain. The math, in the end, worked out, month by thin month. What almost broke him was something underneath the math, a quieter arithmetic he never said out loud but that I recognized because I had done it myself once, at my own kitchen table, in my 50s. It is the arithmetic that measures your worth by your output. Frank had spent 29 years being the man other men looked to for direction on a job site. His identity and his income had grown so tightly braided together that when the income stopped, a large part of what he understood himself to be stopped along with it. Standing behind a hardware store counter for 20 hours a week was not just a pay cut. It was, in his own private ledger, a demotion of the soul, and I do not think you can understand why that season was so hard for him unless you understand that he was not only afraid of not having enough money. He was afraid of finding out that he was not enough of a man without the money. I do not think that fear is unique to construction foremen in Ohio. I think it is close to universal in a culture that has quietly taught all of us, since childhood, to answer the question of who we are with the question of what we produce, and what we are paid for producing it. And I think this is exactly why the Manna story insists so stubbornly on a daily rhythm rather than a stockpiled achievement. If your worth were measured the way the world measures it, by accumulated surplus, then a people with no storehouse, gathering just enough to survive one more day, would be the most worthless people on earth, 40 years running. And yet Scripture does not describe them that way. It describes them as chosen, as carried, as the specific object of a father's attention, precisely during the years when they had nothing stored up and nothing to show for themselves beyond what that day's gathering had provided. Their worth was never in the storehouse. It was never going to be in the storehouse. I think Frank's worth was never actually in the crew of 11 he used to run, either, though it took him the better part of a year behind that counter to begin to believe it. I have thought, too, about why it was a porch and not something grander that first cracked open Frank's new season, and I think there is something instructive in the smallness of it. It was not a contract. It was not a career. It was a sagging board a neighbor happened to mention over a fence, the kind of small offering that is easy to overlook if you are still scanning the horizon for something the size of your old life. I wonder how much daily bread goes ungathered simply because we are standing outside our tents looking for a harvest when what has actually fallen is a handful of very ordinary flakes, easy to miss, easy to step over, because they do not look like the abundance we had imagined asking for. I think about Frank sometimes now, years later, when I pass the hardware store, which someone else owns now, and which no longer has a counter job for a man in his 50s to lean against while he figures out what a demotion of the soul can teach a person that a promotion never could. He went back into construction eventually, smaller jobs, his own small crew of 3 instead of 11, and he told me the last time I saw him that he no longer measures a good year by the size of the crew. He measures it, he said, by whether he woke up each of those 365 mornings able to ask honestly for what that particular day required, rather than lying awake trying to solve the whole year in the dark. I do not think that is a small thing for a man who spent 29 years believing that the size of his crew was the measure of his worth to finally say out loud. It took him a long, humbling year behind a counter to arrive at a sentence that simple. And I have come to think that most of us will need our own long year before we can say something equally simple about our own lives, and that there is no shortcut through it, only the daily practice of walking outside the tent, one honest morning at a time, until the practice itself becomes the thing that finally teaches us what the years of anxious planning never could. I do not know if you are in a season like Frank's. I do not know if you are in a season like the one I was in at my own kitchen table, staring at numbers that would not resolve no matter how many times I ran them. But I want to say something plainly, because ledgers taught me to be plain about numbers even when I am uncertain about everything else. There is a difference between the ledger of debt and the ledger of grace, and they are not measured the same way, and if you keep trying to read one using the rules of the other, you will misjudge everything. The ledger of debt is cumulative. It remembers. Every missed payment carries forward, compounding, refusing to forget, and this is not evil, it is simply how debt behaves, the way water behaves according to gravity whether you like it or not. But grace is not cumulative in that way, and God's provision, according to the manna story, is not either. It does not carry a balance forward from yesterday's fear. Each morning is its own transaction, cleared fresh, unrelated to whether you managed yesterday well or badly. This is either the most reckless economic system ever proposed, or it is the only one that could possibly hold a human heart steady for 40 years in a wilderness. And I have come, slowly, unwillingly, the way an old accountant comes to anything that cannot be proven with a formula, to believe it is the second. There is a kind of morning prayer that treats God like a vending machine: insert enough faith, receive the desired amount of cash. And I want to be honest that I do not trust that kind of prayer, because it turns God into a transaction rather than a father, and it sets you up to believe that if the money does not appear, your faith was defective, which is a cruelty I have watched done to people I love. That is not what I am describing this morning, and it is not what the manna story describes either. The manna did not arrive because the Israelites had achieved a sufficient quantity of belief. It arrived because God had already decided to provide, and their task was simply to go outside and gather what was already falling. I think that changes what a morning prayer for provision is actually for. It is not a spell to produce money out of the air. It is a daily walk outside your tent, so to speak, to see what has already been provided for today, so that you gather it with open hands instead of missing it entirely because you were still inside, arguing with yesterday's fear or measuring tomorrow's shortfall. Some mornings the provision looks exactly like you hoped. Often it does not. It looked, for Frank, like a counter job at a hardware store and a sagging porch repair, not like the crew of 11 he used to run. I cannot promise you it will look like what you are picturing. I can tell you, from 4 decades of watching real ledgers belonging to real, struggling people, that it rarely arrives all at once, and it rarely arrives in the form of the original plan. It arrives daily, in pieces sized exactly to that day's need, which is either an insult to your dignity or the deepest mercy imaginable, depending entirely on whether you have made peace with not being in control of the whole month. So let us pray, you and I want you to actually say this, not read it silently the way you might read a caption, because there is something about the sound of your own voice claiming these words that matters, the same way there was something about the sound of your own need, typed into the comments, that mattered a few minutes ago. If you have not typed it yet, you still can. I will still be here when you come back. Father, I am not asking you for a warehouse this morning. I am asking you for today's bread. You saw what the wilderness generation could not carry, and you did not give them a year's supply, because a year's supply would have rotted in their hands and made them trust a container instead of you. I confess that I have spent nights trying to solve next month with tonight's fear, gathering worry the way they tried to gather extra manna, and it has left me exhausted, and it has not fed me even once. Forgive me for treating anxiety as if it were preparation. It is not preparation. It is only wait. I bring you the actual number this morning, Lord, whatever it is, however small or however large it feels when I say it out loud. You are not frightened by my arithmetic. You are not frightened by an entire nation's hunger in a desert with no visible food source for 100 miles in any direction, and you are not frightened by my rent, my invoice, my medical bill, my overdue notice, whatever shape my hunger has taken this particular week. I ask you plainly, the way Frank might have asked, standing at a counter with nothing left to perform, to provide what today requires. Not because I have earned it through some quota of belief, but because you have already decided, before I ever asked, to be the kind of father who feeds his children. Teach me to gather with open hands rather than clenched ones. Where there is work to be done today that I have been too proud or too afraid to do, put it in front of me plainly, The way a porch needing repair was put in front of a man who used to run a crew of 11 and thought that kind of work was beneath the life he used to have. Where there is provision I cannot yet see, because I am still standing inside my tent arguing with yesterday. Walk me outside this morning and show me what has already fallen while I was busy being afraid. I released the ledger of yesterday's lack. I released the compounding fear of tomorrow's unknown total. I ask only for today, in the shape you choose to give it, trusting that you have never once, in the entire history of everyone who has ever prayed this kind of prayer honestly, been the reason a person starved while waiting on you. Lord, if there is shame mixed into my asking this morning, some old belief that my need is itself a mark against my worth, I ask you to remove it, the way you removed the guilt from a wilderness camp that never once had to earn its bread through better behavior. I do not want to bring you a performance. I want to bring you an honest number and an honest heart. If there is a specific bill this morning, name it with me now, silently or aloud, and hand it to me the way Frank finally handed his mortgage across a folding table to a man who could not fix it either, but who could at least stop pretending it was not real. There is relief simply in stopping the pretending. If today requires quail as well as bread, some particular comfort I have been embarrassed to ask for because it feels like more than mere survival, I bring that too, trusting that you were not offended by a hungry people's appetite for something more than bare grain, and you are not offended by mine. If today requires guidance rather than only provision, some decision I do not know how to make, some door I cannot tell is open or shut, send the pillar alongside the bread, the way you always have, because you have never treated my confusion and my hunger as two separate assignments handled by two different departments of your care. And if today's bread is meant to travel to me through the hands of someone else, a neighbor, a friend, a stranger who becomes a friend, give me the humility to receive it without the shame that so often accompanies help, and give me the courage to be someone else's hands as well, when it is my turn to carry a portion of bread to a table I did not know was empty. Let today's bread be enough, and let me recognize it when it comes, even if it does not look like what I asked for. Amen. Say it again tomorrow morning, in your own words if these are not the right ones, because tomorrow will need its own asking, and that is not a flaw in the design. It is the entire design. I want to tell you about a practice I began during that hard year at my own kitchen table, not because I think it is magic, but because it is the closest thing I ever found to gathering manna with my own hands rather than simply talking about gathering manna in the abstract. Every morning, before I opened the store's ledger, I opened a small notebook that belonged only to me, and I wrote down one line. Not a budget. Not a projection. One line, answering one question. What does today actually require? Not this month. Not this quarter. Today. Some mornings the line was short. Groceries and gas. Some mornings the line was heavier. The mortgage is due in 4 days and I do not yet see how. I wrote it anyway, in plain language, the way you would write a fact rather than a fear, and then I closed the notebook and went to work. I want to tell you what changed, because it was not what I expected. I did not become wealthier by writing that line. The money did not multiply because of a notebook. What changed was the shape of my attention. Instead of a single sprawling, formless dread covering the next 6 months, I had one specific, nameable need sitting in front of me each morning, small enough to actually pray about with any precision, small enough to actually watch get answered piece by piece, the way Frank watched his porch repairs and counter shifts add up to a paid mortgage without ever once adding up to the crew of 11 he used to run. A vague dread cannot be prayed about specifically, because it has no edges. A single day's honest need has edges, and edges are exactly what a prayer can wrap itself around. I still keep a version of that notebook, decades later, mostly retired, mostly out of habit now rather than necessity. I am not telling you to copy my method exactly, I am telling you that the manna story is not only theology. It is also, if you let it, a fairly precise instruction for how to structure your own attention when money is the thing keeping you awake. Name today's actual need, specifically, in plain language, and bring that specific thing to God, rather than the sprawling 6-month fog that has no edges and therefore no place for a prayer to land. I want to say one more thing about the worms in that 16th chapter, because I think we skip past it too quickly, embarrassed by it, the way you skip past an uncomfortable detail in a story you are telling children. The bread that rotted did not rot because God stopped providing. It rotted because it was gathered for the wrong day, held past its purpose, out of fear rather than faith. I think there is a version of that in every one of us who has ever tried to solve a problem before its actual morning arrived. We gather worry for Thursday on Monday, and by Thursday it has gone bad in our hands, and we are exhausted from carrying rotten bread nobody asked us to carry in the first place. I mentioned my father's shop at the very beginning of this, and I have been circling back to it in my mind the whole time I have been talking to you, so let me finally say the rest of it. My father sold seed and feed and small farm implements out of a building that had been his own father's before him, and he was, by every account I ever heard from the men who worked for him, an honest man and a careful one. I kept his books for the last 3 years before it closed, which means I have an unusually intimate, unusually painful vantage point on exactly how it happened, because I was the one writing down the numbers as they got worse. It was not recklessness. It was a chain of small, ordinary misfortunes, a wet spring that ruined a season's seed orders, a competitor 2 towns over who could buy in bulk at a price my father never could, a bank that tightened its terms at precisely the wrong quarter. None of it was his fault in any way I could locate, sitting there with the ledger open in front of me, month after month, watching the red creep further down the page than the black could climb back up. He prayed about that shop every morning of his life, as far as I ever knew. He was not a careless man, spiritually or financially. And the shop closed anyway, in my 23rd year, and I watched my father, a man I had never once seen cry, sit at that same counter and weep over a set of numbers I had written in my own hand. I tell you this because I do not want you to leave this reflection thinking that a right prayer, prayed rightly, guarantees the outcome you are hoping for. I do not believe that, and I think it would be a lie to imply it, however comforting the lie might feel for the length of a video. What I watched happen to my father was not the failure of his faith. It was the failure of a shop, which is a different thing entirely, and I did not understand the difference for years. My father did not stop believing God fed him daily bread. He simply had to learn, in his 60s, starting over, working for another man for the first time since he was a boy, that the daily bread was never actually stored inside that building. It only ever looked, for a while, like it was. He worked for the feed mill I mentioned earlier for the last 11 years of his working life, in a job with far less standing than owning his own shop. And he told me once, near the end, that those 11 years taught him more about actual daily provision than the 30 years of ownership before them ever had. Because ownership had let him believe, falsely, that the storehouse was his to control. I do not offer this as a tidy resolution. I offer it because I think you deserve the truth about what this kind of trust can cost, and what it does not promise, even while I still believe, having watched my father's whole life unfold, that the bread never actually stopped falling. It simply stopped arriving in the shape he had built his identity around, the way it stopped arriving in the shape Frank had built his around too. There is also the other half of that instruction, the part about the day before the Sabbath, and I think it deserves a moment before we close, because it tells you something about the character behind the provision, not just the mechanics of it. God did not ask them to trust him into exhaustion. On the 6th day, he told them to gather twice as much, specifically so the 7th day could be rest rather than one more day of scavenging. Provision, in this story, is not only about survival. It is also about permission to stop. I do not think it is an accident that a man like Frank, once his patchwork of small jobs settled into a rhythm, told me that the strangest gift of that whole hard season was learning that he no longer needed to be the one holding everything up by himself. He said it felt like being handed a double portion the night before he finally let himself rest. I have kept books for other people my entire working life, and I am an old man now, mostly retired, though I still do a little bookkeeping for the church down the road because habits like that do not fully let go of you. I have watched more ledgers than I can count fail to balance by the world's rules and somehow, inexplicably, hold together anyway, month after month, in households that by any honest accounting should have collapsed years earlier. I do not have a tidy theological explanation for why some prayers for provision seem to be answered so plainly, and others seem to go unanswered for what feels, from the outside, like an unbearably long time. I am not going to pretend to a certainty about that which I do not have. What I can tell you, from 4 decades of numbers, is that I have never once seen a person who kept returning, morning after morning, hands open, asking honestly for today's bread rather than a lifetime guarantee, come away from that practice bitter. Worn sometimes. Tired sometimes. But not bitter. There is something that happens to a heart that keeps asking for daily bread instead of demanding a warehouse, even in seasons when the daily bread is thin. It does not calcify into despair the way a heart does when it has spent all its strength trying to gather and hoard and control an entire future it was never given the grip strength to hold. So here is what I would ask of you, before you go on with your own morning, whatever it holds. If this kind of unhurried company was useful to you, consider subscribing, not because the number matters to me particularly. An old bookkeeper does not need much, but because there will be other mornings like this one, and I would rather you find them than lose them in the scroll. If it helped, tell someone else who is doing the quiet arithmetic of not having enough this week, because that kind of sharing costs you 30 seconds and might be someone else's answered prayer showing up in an unexpected form, the way a hardware store counter job showed up for Frank. And before you close this out, I want to ask you a second question, different from the first one, because the first one was about your need and this one is about your history. Tell me, if you are willing, about a time provision arrived for you in a shape you did not expect, a form that did not look like what you had originally prayed for but turned out, later, to have been exactly enough. I would like to read those. I think other people gathering their own bread this morning would like to read them too. I think, if I am honest with you at the end of all this, that the hardest part of trusting a daily economy is not theological at all. It is temperamental. Some of us were simply built, by nature or by early experience, to feel safest when we can see the whole shape of a thing in advance, the entire month laid out, the entire year accounted for, every contingency mapped before we will allow ourselves to exhale. I am one of those people. It is, in some ways, what made me good at the only trade I ever practiced. And it is exactly the temperament the wilderness was designed to retrain, gently but relentlessly, for 40 years, one morning at a time, until an entire generation that had known nothing but either slavery or sand finally crossed into a settled land where they would, at last, plant fields and store grain like everyone else. I find it moving that God did not ask them to live on daily bread forever. The manna stopped, according to the book of Joshua, the very day after they ate the produce of that new land for the first time. The daily economy was a season, not a permanent sentence. I think that is worth remembering if you are in the middle of your own version of it right now. The wilderness is real, and it can last far longer than anyone would choose, and it is not, according to Scripture's own witness, meant to be the whole of your story. But I have also come to believe, watching my father's later years, and watching my own kitchen table season, and watching Frank behind that counter, that something is built in a person during the daily years that cannot be built any other way, and that the people who eventually cross into their own version of a settled land carry something out of the wilderness that the people who never had to gather daily bread simply do not have. Call it calibration. Call it a kind of trust that has actually been tested against real mornings rather than only discussed in comfortable ones. I do not think God wastes those years, even when, especially when, they last far longer than we would have scheduled them ourselves. If you are still in yours this morning, I do not have a formula to shorten it, and I would not trust anyone who claimed to. What I have is this. The bread fell every single morning of those 40 years, without exception, across every mile of that entire journey, regardless of how the previous day's gathering had gone, regardless of how much grumbling had happened the night before, regardless of whether the people felt, on any given morning, that they deserved it. I do not know your specific number this morning, the one you may have already typed into the comments, or the one you are still holding privately because it feels too raw to say to strangers. I do know that the pattern underneath 40 years of desert mornings has not changed, and that a God who fed an entire ungrateful, frightened, complaining nation every day for 4 decades without missing a single sunrise is not the kind of provider who suddenly, arbitrarily, decides to let one particular person's rent go unpaid out of indifference. I am not promising you the shape it will take. I have told you enough about Frank and my father to be honest that the shape often surprises you, sometimes disappoints the version of yourself that had a very specific plan. But the bread, in one form or another, keeps falling. It has never yet, in the entire history of this practice, been the case that God ran out first. I am going to close my ledger now, the real one, the one on my kitchen table, not the metaphor, an actual leather-bound book of numbers I have kept out of habit since before some of you were born. I do this every evening, and every morning I open it again, because that is the nature of ledgers. They are never finished, they only ever record one day at a time, which I have come to think is not a limitation of bookkeeping but possibly its deepest wisdom, learned secondhand from a desert story about bread that could not be stockpiled and was never meant to be. There is one last entry in my own private notebook, from the morning after the hardware store finally called to offer me the position that ended my worst year, and I want to read it to you, because I wrote it before I knew it was the last hard morning of that particular season, which is, I think, how most of these mornings actually end. You rarely get advance notice that today's bread is the final piece of a long, thin stretch. You only find that out afterward, looking back, the way you only recognize a wilderness has become a settled land once you have already been eating the produce of the new fields for a while without quite noticing the manna had stopped falling. What I wrote that morning was short. It said simply, "Today requires groceries and half of the electric bill, and I do not yet see where the other half comes from, and I am going to walk outside anyway." I did not know, writing that sentence, that a phone call was already on its way to me that same afternoon. I only knew that the sentence itself, small and specific and honestly stated, was the whole of what that particular morning required of me. I think that is the entire shape of this practice. When you strip away the theology and the history and even the ledger metaphor I have leaned on this whole time to make sense of it for myself. Wake, name the actual need, bring it honestly to the one who has never yet failed to feed a people who kept walking outside their tents to look for it, and then go, in whatever direction the day requires, trusting that the bread you cannot yet see is not the same as bread that does not exist. Whatever today asks of you, whatever number is sitting unresolved on your own private page this morning, I hope you walk outside your tent and find that it has already, in some form, begun to fall. Gather only what today requires. Trust that tomorrow will have its own morning, and its own bread, and its own instructions waiting for you when you get there. That has been true for longer than any ledger I have ever kept, and I have no reason, After 41 years of watching numbers refuse to explain the ways people actually survived, to believe it will stop being true today.